Good afternoon, everyone. From Chicago, this is Bill McHugh, Executive Director of the National Fireproofing Contractors Association. Welcome to today's NFCA webinar. Really glad that you've taken some time out of your busy schedules to cover a topic that's near and dear to our hearts here, and that's the importance of maintaining fireproofing, fire resistance in existing buildings. It seems in our construction industry that many are focused on new construction. Why? It's easy to find. All you have to do is visit the CMD or FW Dodge Data Analytics portals on the internet, and you can find projects everywhere. But what about all the existing buildings? As I stand in Chicago at our office looking out the window, I can see the skyline of the city of Chicago. I can see the Sears Tower, now known as the Willis Tower, John Hancock Building, Aon Building, high-rise buildings near and far, miles of them downtown Chicago. We know that they've had fireproofing installed in those buildings that have had steel construction and possibly some that had concrete construction and needed extra fireproofing. But what about the in-place service of that fireproofing? How's it taken care of? That's what we're going to cover today in today's program. Really appreciate you taking the time to be part of it. The National Fireproofing Contractors Association provides these webinars free of charge as a benefit to the industry. It's your dues, those members that are members, it's your dues that help fund the ability for us to provide these webinars. So those that are members, thank you. Those that are not members, we certainly hope you join the NFCA so that we can all benefit from the good things that the NFCA does. NFCA is managed by the McHugh Company. Sandy Addison and I work together and manage the operations day-to-day of the National Fireproofing Contractors Association. Strategic direction is given by the board of directors. I'm not going to read their names, but just know that your association has a very good group of leaders that works together for the good of the fire resistance industry. This board of directors is meeting next week on Monday evening and Tuesday next week to discuss future issues in the fireproofing industry as they meet as a board to review the business of the association and also the industry and fire and life safety as well. What's the NFCA provide as an association? The National Fireproofing Contractors Association provides world-class instruction on fire-resistive materials. Currently, our education is focused on spray fire-resistant materials, intumescent fire-resistant materials, but look for more materials to be added over the next 12 to 18 months as the NFCA expands its education on other types of fire-resistant materials. We provide technical expertise to members, specifiers, building officials, fire marshals. If you have a code question, standards question, our phone lines are always open. Email is always open too. Feel free to contact us. The NFCA works at the standards and code development processes. We participate at ASTM. We participate at the International Code Council and the NFCA. Our educational conference every year provides an opportunity for fireproofing companies, manufacturers, distributors, contractors, reps, and others to learn from each other about how to protect buildings with fire resistance. The NFCA's contractor accreditation program for both the IFRM and the SFRM gives the ability for fireproofing companies to separate themselves from others that don't have that type of education. The NFCA-online.org website is also the way to find fireproofing leaders throughout the US, Canada, and other parts of the world as well. NFCA has been quite busy the last year or so. Actually, 5 years since we've taken over, and then also beforehand. Our friend Hugh Dudley, the founding executive director of the NFCA, did a great job of laying a good base for us from which to build the association. Currently, the NFCA is at the International Code Council's code development process for the International Building Code. The 2021 version of that code is finishing up this October with the final action hearings, public comment hearings in Las Vegas, Nevada. We've had several proposals approved and a couple that were not approved. We'll go through those in a little bit. We participate at the ASTM task groups on fireproofing. We participate, I am a member of the NFPA's Fire Protection Features Committee. We work with the American Institute of Steel Construction, the American Iron and Steel Institute as well, as we partner to promote fire resistance in buildings. We also are involved with the National Building Code of Canada code development process through the National Research Council of Canada. The NFCA had submitted a couple of code proposals on that as well. As a result of all this work, our membership continues to trend upward, and we continue to attract members near and far. We've got some more webinars coming up. Mark your calendars now, October 29, November 19th, December 11th. It's a great webinar series, different topics, some focused on contracting altogether, some focused on fire resistance and fireproofing. Also, for those of you that are interested, don't miss the Fire Resistance in Buildings Seminar in Los Angeles, taking place Thursday, October 3rd, at the LA Grand in the hotel in Los Angeles. We've got some great speakers. The California State Fire Marshal's Office has Crystal Sujeski coming, and then OSHPD, the healthcare regulator in California, the lead person there, Nancy Timmons, is going to come speak as well, along with NFCA members that are on panels. A great group of speakers, generic fireproofing information. It's worth traveling in. If you haven't been to one of these educational seminars, it's worth traveling in, contractors, manufacturers, and others. Big thank you to our sponsors, as you see on the screen, Sherwin-Williams, Hilti, Nathan Kimmel, Isolatech, GCP Applied Technologies, Carboline, and HyFlex. All really appreciate the sponsorship that they've brought. 2020, mark your calendar again. Austin, Texas, here we come. April 13 to 15 for the NFCA Contractor Accreditation Program training, and then April 15 to 17 on the Educational Conference and Meeting. Two separate programs, one to get educated in order to get yourself as a company Contractor Accreditation Program accredited, and then the other 3 days for conference education, and then also committee meetings and a good fun activity that will take place as well. Members, again, thank you for being a member. You make these programs possible. Those that are not members, join now. Contractors can join for $500 for the rest of 2019, and then in January, your dues will be $1,400, but that includes one free person at the conference. You have to pay your own airfare and hotel, but the $1,400 has built into it one person at the conference for those several days. That includes food at the meetings when the meetings take place. You want to join? Email Sandy at nfca-online.org for an application. And just know that NFCA membership is an investment not just in your company, but also your industry. Picture that you see in front of you is the class from last year that took the NFCA Contractor Accreditation Program exams. Great programs, great group of people, and we're glad that, that they could be there. Onward to today's program. For today's program, we're going to cover maintenance of fire resistance in buildings. So before I get started, and while we're kind of in between, let's do a quick sound check. If you can hear me, raise your hand on your little profile there. There's a little text box there. So if you can hear me, raise your hand. Awesome. So we've got people listening. It's a good check for to make sure that people are listening and make sure that people are on the line as well. Really appreciate that people have taken some time out of their busy schedules to be part of this webinar. So yes, I've got my name up here and John Tagliani's. John Tagliani is the past president of the NFCA. He and I did a presentation in Worcester, Massachusetts this April, in addition to a demonstration fire test that we did. That's why I've got his name up here, because that demonstration fire test demonstrated what happens when various materials are installed over foam for thermal barriers. It was really quite eye-opening to see what happens when intumescent fire-resistant materials were put over foam as a thermal barrier, and when materials that are different insulators, different activators, different technologies, I should say, and how it worked and how it didn't work. Because the intumescent doesn't start intumescing till 165 degrees, it makes it difficult to protect the material that starts melting at 135 degrees Fahrenheit. So what we saw was quite alarming, knowing that there are instances where people might think that the products might work to protect foam in buildings where people are. So thank you, John Tegliandi, for all your work to help us in lots of ways, especially on that presentation. I'm going to skip this because we spent some time on what the NFCA does already, but just know that when we're out advocating for your industry, these are the kinds of things that we put up as we talk about the NFCA. The one thing I do want to point out is in this section 179 in red, existing buildings, protecting existing buildings is an important thing. As a matter of fact, our government, the U.S. government, said the same thing. How did they say that? In the tax laws. There's an immediate deduction, in other words, the same year that the expense occurs, for things like fire protection. Fire protection is defined in the building code. What is the name of the chapter for maintenance of fire resistance? Fire and smoke protection features. Fire protection. So therefore, check with your tax accountant, building owners, contractors who are pitching to the building owner that they should maintain their fire resistance. Talk to your tax accountants. Make sure that they agree that the section 179 allows for immediate deduction for the building owner and manager and doesn't wind up as a capital expense depreciated over many years. I think the limitation's about $500,000 US. One thing to remember, fire resistance is a part of a bigger picture. The International Building Codes Chapter 7 title of Fire and Smoke Protection Features covers structural fire resistance and effective compartmentation, both. It mentions them both in the same paragraph. Detection and alarm systems, sprinkler systems, and education of the occupants are also needed to make sure that buildings are safe for the life cycle of the building so that when you and I and our families get into the building, we're safe. I'm going to cover some new construction language, and you might wonder, well, gee, you're doing maintenance presentation, Bill. Why are you covering new construction? Because the building code points back to what was built for new construction. It assumes that the construction was built correctly. However, the fire code, in certain instances, says that even if it wasn't built correctly and the building owner was unaware of that the building owner is still responsible. We'll get into what that specific language is. The reason why we're talking about this program for maintenance is to help create a safe building in our industry. One of the things that happens at the building code hearings when presentations are made is that a certain industry stands up and says, sprinklers, when they operate, are 99.9% effective, and therefore the building is safe. So let's take out some of the fire resistance because people leave the doors open, the fireproofing gets knocked off the steel, or doesn't get put on right, or whatever you want to call it. How do you fight that kind of a statement that's made at the building code hearings? One way to fight it, in the right way, is making sure that A, it's properly designed by a specifier, working with the manufacturers and the contractors to make sure the listings are selected properly, make sure it's installed properly by an NFCA member, accredited contractor, especially the NFCA member, make sure it's inspected to the International Building Codes requirements for special inspection of fireproofing, and then importantly, make sure it's maintained. Each one of those pieces needs to work like a bicycle chain. If the inspection falls down and the installation wasn't right, people won't be safe in buildings because the steel is not protected. While doing some research for this presentation, I spent some time taking a look at the World Trade Center 7 collapse that took place. That was the building that collapsed without a jet plane hitting it. It had debris flying off of it from World Trade Center 1 and 2 when the planes hit it. Because there was no sprinkler operation due to the fact that when the Trade Center Towers 1 and 2 came down, they knocked out the water supply to the rest of the area. So therefore, there's no sprinklers in the building. The buildings burned for a long, long time. It went from probably the 30th floor up to the 69th floor, 30 floors worth, about 14 hours before a progressive collapse took place. What we're trying to do is protect buildings to make sure that doesn't happen, that even if there's sprinklers in the building and there's a malicious attack, because sprinklers are meant to work in limited areas and not fight multiple fires on multiple floors at the same time, unless, of course, they've been designed for it. We want to make sure that the structure is there. So let's talk about the building code first, because the fire code refers to the building code. Just know that structural fire resistance and compartmentation are spoken in the very beginning of the code, 701.1 in the scope. Materials and assemblies are governed in this chapter. Fire resistance ratings are determined by ASTM E119, UL263. If I go to Canada and spend time with my friends there, it's ULC S101. That's the main test for fire resistance. All other fire resistance tests are built off of this, except for the natural gas and oil fire test, which is the UL 1709, has a different time temperature curve, 0 to 2,000 degrees immediately, and then out for 30 minutes, rather than the 0 to 1,000 degrees in 5 minutes, 2,000 degrees after 4 hours. But just know ASTM E119, UL263 are the basis for fire resistance rated construction. Restrained construction has to be identified in the construction documents. Why is this important? Well, guess what? If you're trying to back into what a listing is on a building, it'll be important to know whether it was a restrained construction or unrestrained, to know what the thickness of fireproofing should be in that particular assembly, and to know whether or not to select a restrained or unrestrained beam, column, whatever. The construction documents take place at permit application, but they should be in the building for the life cycle of the building, and we'll get into that later on. I mentioned UL263, ASTM E119, and although I've only highlighted 2 places where it's stated those two standards, please know that number 1, fire resistance designs and approved sources, that would be the UL Fire Resistance Directory or Product IQ. Secondly, prescriptive designs. Prescriptive designs would be also listed assemblies based on the ASTM E119 UL263. Fire resistance designs by an approved agency. An approved agency would be nationally recognized testing laboratory, back to the UL directory, again, for fire resistance. The fire resistance has all kinds of test standards that have been developed in addition to the ASTM E119 UL263. But those 2 test standards are the grandmother, whatever you want to call it, for all the rest of the fire resistance protection features, such as fire stopping, smoke dampers, fire dampers, swinging and rolling fire doors, and fire-rated glazing. This is a key point in fire resistance, and it fits for both new construction and existing buildings. What it says is that the fire resistance has to be their primary, tested the E119 UL263 without the use of an automatic sprinkler on it. So fire protection engineering has to be careful about how it designs alternative methods. It doesn't restrict alternative methods, but it sure does point to the fact that fire resistance needs to be primary based on the E119 UL263 before you start throwing any other tricks at it. This marking that's in 703.7 is really for the barriers only. Fire barriers, smoke barriers, firewalls, any other wall required to have protected openings or penetrations. Could even be a smoke partition. NFCA recommends that the exact barrier marking be used. In other words, use the terms in the International Building Code. Currently, there's no marking required for the fireproofing, only for the barriers. Why? Shouldn't we have some kind of identification device for fireproofing in new construction? It sure would help us at the back end of things when the building's being maintained 30 years later. Some fireproofing's been knocked off, whether it's intumescent, whether it's a wall board that got breached, whether it's an endothermic wrap that somehow got peeled off. Whatever was used to fireproof those assemblies, SFRM, IFRM, we've got to know what it is got to know what the design number was in order to provide the maintenance for it. The NFCA did have a marking proposal for the 2021 International Building Code. We actually 2018 International Building Code. What we had put in was that at the Fire Command Center, there should be a placard on the wall that depicts the manufacturer's product that was used and the listings that were used for that particular application. Didn't pass. We need to flush that out a little bit better and provide for a better code proposal for the future. In Chapter 7, it also refers back to Table 601 to provide fire resistance ratings for the assemblies supported by structural members. That's something to be cognizant of, that for the assemblies supported by the structural members. There'll be a couple slides later on that talk about support of fire resistance in buildings. If anybody has questions, feel free to type them in as we go. I'm happy to try to catch them as we go, and then I'll open it up for questions at the very end. At the very end, those questions can go as long as we are on the phone and as long as you want to have that conversation. 7042 talks about protection of fire resistance rating for the entire column, individual encasement on all sides for the full height. Again, preparing for this presentation, I went into the commentary to see if I could find, actually I went into the definitions to see if I could find individual encasement. It's not defined in the building code. To understand the encasement, if you will. I can tell you in this one, there was a code proposal 2 cycles ago when I sat on the ICC's Fire Safety Committee. There was a proposal that said, let's take a column, protect it with SFRM on 3 sides, and use wallboard for the 4th side. That proposal was disapproved overwhelmingly by the code committee that heard it. This was before I was a part of the National Fireproofing Contractors Association. And the building officials, fire official, voting members of the ICC disapproved it because they believed that the individual encasement was the same material continuously for the full height of that column as well. So that brings up a whole different debate that we don't have time to get into today, but I'll cover some of it as we get into the maintenance of the fire resistance later on in the program. The protection of the primary frame, structural frame other than columns, is also listed in 7043. Secondary attachments, Crystal Sujeski, who's going to speak at the NFCA educational seminar in Los Angeles, put this code proposal in for the 2021 code that asks for protection extending from a structural member a distance of not less than 12 inches for the entire, or it shall be applied to the entire length when the attachment is less than 12 inches long. So in red are some of the changes that were required as it went through the code development process. The original proposal is what you see in black there. This program will be posted in the members only section of nfca-online.org, so members feel free to go get it. Impact protection. Again, you wonder, Bill, why are you spending time on the new construction requirements? Because those new construction requirements flow all the way to the back end. When I say back end, to the life cycle of the building. If there's impact protection that has been put in place so that the fireproofing doesn't get knocked off the steel, column, or assembly, and if that's been removed for whatever reason, it needs to be put back in place. The building code says what it should look like, not less than 5 feet from the finished floor. Barriers are defined in the International Building Code, as are many other assemblies. The reason I put up the definitions for the barriers is because it's a very important part of barriers that relates to structural fireproofing. Know that the ASTM E119 UL263 is how we figure out whether or not the assemblies are, meaning the walls, are rated assemblies, so same fire test. But guess what? In red, I've got something that's very important to know about fire resistance rated barriers. Smoke barriers, fire barriers, and fire partitions, all 3 of them, need supporting construction equal to or greater than the fire resistance rating of the barrier. When the code talks about supporting construction, it talks about continuous supporting construction. So imagine, if you will, a wall running in a building, splitting it in two. Although that wall sits on a certain width, maybe 4 to 6 inches wide, fireproofing on a steel structure, if it was specified as part of that design, the supporting construction has to have that fire resistance rating continuously on that 200,000 square foot floor, and not just over the 6 inches, not just 30 inches on either side of that wall, but continuously for the whole floor assembly. Why? Because if it's not supported, and let's say the structure collapses 100 feet away from where the wall is, that wall might lose its integrity as well. So supporting construction, hugely important. Know that fire testing is done in large scale for fireproofing, small scale for things like fire stopping, with hourly fire resistance ratings. Time temperature curve I mentioned earlier. The way that the fire resistance is tested for walls is using these large furnaces. The NFCA had a great tour of the UL fire test facility about 2 years ago, where we were the guest of UL at all of their fire test laboratories. Over 75 people attended, and we really had a great program, a great day. The wall assembly is then mounted, thermocouples on the non-fire side, to make sure that the temperature of the non-fire side of the barrier doesn't increase 250 degrees above ambient. And the reason why that's there is for egress purposes. Let's say there were a beam on top of that wall that was spray fireproof, that the wall terminated into that beam. That beam would also have to have that 250 degree limiting temperature on the non-fire side, again for egress purposes, in addition to structural fire resistance. Loads applied to horizontal assemblies and roof ceiling assemblies as well. Fire test facility for horizontal assemblies for beams. Our buddy Andy, Rich's friend Andy, Rich Walkie, thank you for the slide. But Andy's obviously removed from the fire furnace before the fire test takes place. The assembly is built, the beam is installed, metal decking over the top, reinforcing steel, concrete poured, and guess how long that's got to cure? 6 months. Why? Because if it's set on fire with too much moisture in there, the slab will just blow to pieces. So the assembly is built, conditioned for 6 months, fireproofing applied, and then if there's a floor ceiling assembly, maybe the ceiling assembly applied, a load applied, which is required for all large-scale assemblies. It's part of the UL 263 standard test method and the ASTM E119. And again, the same fire test curve takes place for floors, takes place for fire stops, takes place for fire-rated glazing. The walls and barriers all get the hose stream test for simulating shock and making sure that the shock of falling ceiling tile hitting the penetrating item or hitting the wall does not put a hole in it as well. Inspection's a big part of new construction as well. And we're going to zip through this real quickly. Just know that special inspection has been required for at least 30-odd years. It's in the legacy codes back in the BOCA days, BOCA National Building Code, the Uniform Building Code, the Southern Building Code, Congress International, and it's in the Chapter 17 of the International Building Code. The NFCA put in a code proposal to make sure that the inspection takes place during construction and then has another visual inspection after the rough installation, electrical, sprinkler, mechanical piping, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason why is because stuff gets knocked off during construction and somebody needs to make sure it's been put back together again. Just know that as a fireproofing contractor that you need to be aware of that to make sure that you've got in your bid or your proposal an exclusion for stuff that's knocked off by others and then repair of that as well. That's going to be part of the 2021 version of the International Building Code. We did it for both SFRM and IFRM materials as well. Inspections done by an approved agency. The approved agency has to be approved. Approved is a defined term, means approved by the building official, and that agency, inspection agency, has got to be approved by the building official. So wherever the International Building Code special inspections are invoked, this is the process for that company being approved by the AHJ to inspect fireproofing. The special inspector also has to be approved by the building official as well. as being competent to inspect that particular type of construction. They've got to be objective, competent, and independent from the contractor, and then they got to demonstrate competency and relevant experience and training in special inspectors. So that means if the special inspector has inspected a little tiny building, 5 stories, they might not be competent enough to inspect a 50-story, 100-story building. That's up to the authority having jurisdiction to decide. Not me, not the NFCA, not anyone else, but it's the AHJ that determines that. The registered design professional can become the approved agency if they qualify as a special inspector as well. How do you get competency? The NFCA has a fireproofing exam, the ICC has a fireproofing exam, and then demonstrate experience through your resume as an inspection agency. There's an AC 291 inspection agency accreditation program. I'm not going to go into it, but just know that that exists as well. As far as discrepancies, they're going to be brought to the immediate attention of the contractor, and then the inspections based on the fire resistance design. I'm going to zip through this stuff because this is the new construction, but just know that the inspection assumes that the fireproofing was installed properly, inspected properly, and works at the end of the day. The 2018 International Fire Code asks for an as-built inventory of fire resistance. That's going to be specified by the architect ahead of time. That architect has to specify qualifications for inspectors and installers, contractors, and inspection agencies, as mentioned earlier. And that's usually referenced in Division 1. As far as the fire codes goes, here's where we're going to spend a bunch of time. An FPA 101, which is used in the healthcare environments exclusively, and the reason I shouldn't say exclusively, in addition to the International Fire Code. An FPA 101 is what the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services uses as the basis to audit facilities for compliance for fire and life safety items, as well as other items too. So an FPA 101, when in the healthcare environment, hospitals, CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, won't reimburse the healthcare facility if they're not in compliance with the NFPA 101. The state's departments of health might not accredit that organization to do business in that particular jurisdiction if they're not complying with the International Fire Code. So hospitals have some heavy regulations to deal with, and as a result, have some of the best when it comes to facility directors. Most of them members of that American Society for Healthcare Engineering, a division of the American Hospital Association. Great organization for facility directors, and a great organization for fireproofing contractors to get to know those individuals, because they might be the customer that would buy these types of services that we'll talk about later. Just know that whenever a device, equipment, system, or condition, including fire-resistant construction, is there, it's got to be continuously maintained in accordance with applicable NFPA requirements. If it's obvious to the public, then the fire resistance has to be maintained or removed. So let's think about fireproofing in a parking garage of a hospital, and maybe a whole bunch of it was knocked off, but guess what? They reduced the fire resistance and eliminated the need for it for whatever reason. Just the presence of it, if it's been knocked off, and it's obvious to the public, it's got to be maintained continuously, just like it was fire resistance rated. Then it talks again about fire resistant construction requiring periodic testing, inspection, or operation. Has to be tested, inspected, or operated as specified elsewhere. Testing, in this case, would be a visual inspection of that fireproofing to make sure it's still there, because it assumes that it was installed right. The maintenance, inspection, and testing of fire resistance shall be performed under the supervision of a responsible person who ensures that testing, inspection, and maintenance are made at specified intervals in accordance with applicable standards or as directed by the AHJ. NFPA 1 is the fire code. So NFPA 101 is the life safety code used in hospitals. NFPA 1 might be used in the jurisdiction that you're in. Check with the authority having jurisdiction to see if it's part of your requirements. I can tell you, though, that if a loss of life or property took place because of a failure of the fire resistance, including the fireproofing, that the plaintiff's lawyers are going to be looking for any document that has any reference to fire resistance at all. So NFPA 1, although it might not be in play in a specific jurisdiction, is a standard, is a very specific standard, and would be referenced. Because I know if I were the consultant for the plaintiff's attorneys, I'd be jumping all over all three of these documents to go after the building owner for damages. For those contractors on the phone and inspection agencies, you might want to notify your friendly building owner and manager that they have a risk based on what you're going to see in these next few slides from the fire code. So what the NFPA 1 says is that fire-resistant materials in construction used to subdivide the building, et cetera, prevent the spread of fire, comply with this section, and 12.3. And then 12.3.3 talks about fire-resistive construction. As soon as it says fire-resistive construction, it's talking about fireproofing, talking about fire barriers, firewalls, exterior walls, et cetera. All of it, required fire-resistive construction. And that's the general all-encompassing language, including fireproofing, shall be maintained, properly repaired, restored, or replaced where damaged, altered, breached, penetrated, removed, or improperly installed. So let's take a minute and look at that. So the walls need to be maintained, firewalls, fire barriers, exterior walls. In my opinion, it adds a smoke barrier because a smoke barrier acts as a fire barrier. And then, of course, the structural fire resistance. So both of those are required. Then take a look also. Roof coverings. Why would it say roof coverings? Well, roof coverings, some of them get their fire resistance rating from a coating that might be applied to it, or from ballast or gravel that might be applied over the top of it. The testing for fire resistance or spread of flame, intermittent flame, as well as the burning brands to get Class A, B, or C, all of that is done as an assembly on a deck of some kind with insulation, the roof membrane, and then whatever surfacing. Sometimes the surfacing helps the assembly get its Class A, B, C, or D, A, B, or C fire resistance. And then take a look at the other piece. Yeah, it says it's got to be maintained. Then it says properly repaired, restored, or replaced where damaged. That doesn't say how often. It just says when it's damaged, it's got to be repaired. There's further guidance later on in this section. Then it goes on to even talk about fire resistance rated gypsum wall boards or ceilings and how they're supposed to be repaired using the original materials and methods equivalent to the original construction. The Gypsum Association has a document, GA225, available free on their website, GA225, for repairing fire resistance rated gypsum wallboard assemblies, different than just doing a patch on a wall where wallboard compound and a board might be used just to make it look pretty. The wall itself has to withstand the hose stream test, so it gets a whole bunch more protection. Studs behind it, framing, or removing the entire panel and replacing it with the entire panel. And then it says in 12.3.3.3, where readily accessible required fire resistance rated assemblies in high-rise buildings have to be visually inspected for integrity at least once every 3 years. So going back here, where it doesn't tell you how often it's got to be visually inspected, down to 12.3.3.3, it says visually inspected every 3 years based on NFPA 1. But it also says back here to fix it as you go. So there's two topics there. One is how often do you fix it, and the other is how often do you visually inspect it. So with this code, the NFPA 1 is saying is the building owner or manager has to have a process for maintaining, for visually inspecting, for repairing fire resistance when it's breached, altered, penetrated. How does it get breached? bring in a new conduit, knock off the fireproofing, attach it to the beam. Guess what? We have an issue. Damage from construction materials being used above the ceiling where the beams are. Maybe they put in new ceiling tile, and for some reason the ceiling tile touched the fireproofing and knocked it off. Has to be repaired. Gypsum boards repaired a certain way. Take a look at the stud behind that patch in the dotted lines. That tells you that there's much more than just putting wallboard onto something, that it wants a runner, that it wants the gypsum panel patched properly. This is all from the Gypsum Association as well. Horizontal studs, framing the repair, on and on and on. NFPA 1 also looks for a written report prepared by the person responsible for conducting the visual inspection, submitted to the AHJ, documenting the results of the visual inspection. So let's say that this was never done in the building. Who's responsible if there's a fire and there's collapse or something that affects life? Who's responsible? The building owner and manager is responsible for the maintenance of the building. The building official has immunity based on the municipality immunity clauses that is part of their laws. There's also immunity in the building codes as well for the building official. So just know that the building owner and manager has to watch themselves. So NFPA 101, NFPA 1, both have similar language. And let's take a look at the International Fire Code, because it's got similar language to what I just mentioned as well. 3 different codes about maintenance, something that frankly in fire resistance is ignored. When giving presentations to large groups of building owners and managers, I ask questions a whole bunch. The first question I ask is, how many of you have a budget, line item budget, in your building operations profit and loss statement, actually not profit and loss, but expense statement, that particularly lays out maintaining the sprinkler system, the fire pump, and all the things associated with the sprinkler system? All the hands go up. How many of you have a line item budget for maintaining your alarm system? All the hands go up. How many of you have a budget for maintaining your fire resistance? A line item budget for maintaining the structural steel fireproofing, the barriers, the fire stops, the dampers, the doors, and everything else. And that's when I get blank stares. It's not in the culture of our industry, building owners and managers industry yet, to maintain the fire resistance just like everything else. It's assumed it's there and it's going to work. Silent policeman has been the term used in various articles, one from the UK that I had found years ago that called the, quote, passive fire protection, the silent policeman. Well, how can it be a silent policeman if it's not maintained? Take a look at the International Fire Code, 703.1. Same language, fire resistance rated construction, included but not limited to structural members. See that? Fire resistant materials, fire resistive coatings, and then these elements need to be visually inspected by the owner annually and properly repaired, restored, replaced where damaged, altered, breached, or penetrated. Same language that we saw in NFPA 1 and NFPA 101. Goes on to say that records of the inspections and repairs need to be maintained. This has been in this code since 2006 or before. And it goes on to talk about protecting things with approved methods. So when working in existing buildings, that means that the UL directory, Intertech directory, FM approval guide are the roadmap for repairing fire resistance rated assemblies. In addition to the manufacturer's installation instructions, manufacturer's repair instructions. In the 2018 version of the International Fire Code, it broke the sections for fire resistance into multiple individual sections. When you look at this section, it talks about a laundry list all in one paragraph. When looking at the 2018 version of the International Fire Code, it breaks it out by different types of construction. The overall charging language talks about structural fire resistance and compartmentation, fire resistance rated construction, separation of adjacent spaces. And then 701.2 talks about the various assemblies that are supposed to be maintained. And each of those assemblies has its own section: the walls, barriers, partitions, horizontal assembly, shaft enclosures, and then it goes on to talk about fire dampers, fire-rated doors, glazing, fire stops, et cetera, et cetera. The NFCA put in another code proposal to add that the structural steel fireproofing have its own section as well. That'll be in the 2021 version of the International Fire Code. It was missed as it went into the 2018 version of the Fire Code, so the NFCA put together a code proposal to make sure it got in. So records of inspection and repairs have to be maintained by the building owners and managers. The only time where visual inspection is not required of fire resistance is where it's concealed. What the fire code assumes is where it's concealed, it's assumed that it was installed properly in the first place. However, going back here, the building owner and manager has some liability with one section. If you remember correctly, as we got to this spot, it talked about the building owner and manager responsible in 12.331 for things that have been improperly installed. So even though there might be a hard ceiling where there's beams that have been protected with fireproofing, maybe every once in a while cut a hole in that ceiling to see if the appropriate installation was done at new construction. Because the building owner and manager is responsible for this. So they have to do it right away and do it every year? No. But maybe it's a way to check and make sure everything's been done properly. In 701.6, under owner's responsibility, and this is brand new, it's requiring an inventory of fire resistance rated and smoke resistant construction. That means that if the building owner is asked by the fire marshal, hey, can you show me your inventory of fire resistance? And the building owner laughs and says, inventory? What inventory? And the fire official says, you know, the plans and specifications that were used to build the fire resistance in this building. You know, the SFRM materials or IFRM materials that were used, or boards or wraps for all these columns and beams. The building owner laughs again and says, I haven't had those things in here for 50 years. Building's 100 years old, have no idea. Well, guess what? 701.6 of the International Fire Code, where it's invoked and where it's adopted, says the building owner needs to have documentation. What's that mean to the building owner? They've got to hire somebody to document what's there. Maybe the fireproofing contractor can work with a fire protection engineering firm to work to determine what the fire resistance rated assemblies are made of. In other words, identify the steel size, identify the type of fireproofing that's on the beams and columns and floors, horizontal assemblies, and then document that and back their way into it. It's an opportunity to provide the building owner and manager with the basis they need to maintain the fire resistance. If we don't know what's there, how are we going to maintain it? If we don't maintain it and it doesn't perform, it gives other industries the ability to say, you know, that fire resistant stuff just doesn't work. Let's just get rid of it all. We don't need it anyway. We do need it. It's an important part of structural fire protection. What's the inventory? It's the life safety drawings, structural drawings. It's the listings from the UL directory, Intertech directory, or FM approval guide. It's the manufacturer's installation and maintenance instructions as well. They could be paper files, spreadsheets, software, whatever you want to call it. Division 1 of specifications should have some information about this as well. The building owner and manager can be spoken to through specifications if the specifier is quite creative as they go through it. Division 1, 017800, closeout submittals, starts the process. Not the commissioning section, but the closeout submittals starts the process. The specifier, using the International Fire Code and their specification sections, using master format as the numbering system, for walls, for instance, can reference Division 9, 092100 for patching fire resistance rated gypsum assemblies. They can do this in Division 1 of the specifications and reference the International Fire Code as the reason why maintenance of these assemblies is required. And in new construction, Division 1 asks for the documentation for all of these various types of assemblies, including the structural steel protections, SFRM and IFRM, using 078100 as the place for patching of fire resistance rated construction. Penetrations would be in 8400, doors in Division 8, ducts in Division 23. Additionally, in Division 1, there's a number of spaces where, believe it or not, the architect can specify maintenance data for things like fire resistance rated assemblies, patching, the fireproofing, fire stops, the dampers, the doors. It's in 017823.16 maintenance data. So the specifier can affect how maintenance takes place at new construction. This sets the stage for new construction for the life cycle of the building, which is something that's getting a lot more attention these days. And then to provide the inventory of fire resistance needed, the specifier in Division 1, 017839, can specify what project record documents are required to be passed on from the fireproofing contractor to the general contractor to the building owner and manager, so that that building owner and manager has an inventory of all their fire resistance. How do we maintain that fire resistance? That's a big question. You know, now that we know that the fire code has some really strong language that speaks to the building owner and manager saying, maintain that fire resistance. That language is really quite strong. And while there's not a lot of incidents that say, God, there's a huge risk here, and it doesn't show up as a big risk here, it's huge. Other industries don't have as much trouble as the passive fire protection industry, proving that they need to have some maintenance done. If the roof leaks, the people on the top floor, that's me, on the 5th floor of this building that we have our offices in, if there's a roof leak above my desk, I'm going to be screaming and yelling downstairs to the facility director to fix that leak. If the fireproofing's been knocked off on the beam or column above that ceiling tile, I have no idea it's gone because I'm walking in the office doing my work and leaving. However, just know that I'm a little bit goofy. So you know that I'm going to be crawling above the ceiling and taking a look with a flashlight from time to time just to see what's going on. But I'm not every person. Most people don't do that kind of stuff. They don't pay any attention to that fire resistance. Think about it. How many times have you walked through a building in a corridor that might be fire resistance rated? There's a hole in it, a breach in the fire resistance rated construction. People could walk by that for weeks before it gets fixed. A leak in a roof, I want it fixed now. So that fire code is something that should be communicated to our building owner and manager friendly community. We've already started by presenting to the American Society for Healthcare Engineering. We've done the same presentation for the Construction Specifications Institute, for the Construction Specifications Canada, and for other building owner and manager groups, the Association of Physical Plant Administrators. After we speak, some of them come up because they say, you know what, you're absolutely right. We don't have a program for taking care of this. And look, it's right there in the building or the fire code. Now that we know that things have to be done, how do we figure out if there's no documentation in the building, what is in the building? It's an analysis process that takes place. A listing analysis is the first thing. Onto the job site we go with a tablet or a laptop or something with an internet connection so we can get into the UL Product IQ, the FM Approval Guide, the Intertech Directory, and figure out what's there. If there's some documentation, at least structural drawings that show a UL design, Intertech design, FM approval design, we can back into what materials are there. In the designs, it will lay out whose material was used and at what thickness on which size beams. And then it can be backed into what the assembly is there. Drawings will tell us whether the assemblies are restrained or unrestrained, and give us the materials used, the thicknesses, steel shape, size, and the fire resistance ratings. These are all the questions that are used to back our way into what is the design that was used on that particular structural element, whether it's a horizontal assembly, a beam, or a column. Once it's been breached, broken, fireproofing removed, what do we do? What should the building owner manager do? First thing is to contact the fireproofing installer if it's known. New construction, if the building's less than a few years old, those records might be readily available. Why use the installer that installed it? There might be a warranty that was given by the contractor to the building owner and manager for that. The minute a contractor touches that material that was not the original contractor, that warranty could be null and void. So start with the fireproofing contractor installer that worked on the building in the first place. Then we got to determine, how do we patch this? What do we do? In the fall issue 2018 of Life Safety Digest, available online, so just Google Life Safety Digest fireproofing patching. If you Google that term, it'll bring up this magazine right away. In that magazine are quotes from all the fireproofing manufacturer members of the NFCA that provided input about how to patch their materials for longevity, for consistency of the materials as well. How do we identify what fireproofing is there in the first place? Maybe there's an inventory of fireproofing that's been left there by the fireproofing contractor. Let's say the building's 30 years old, 40 years old. Maybe down in the basement someplace there's some bags of material. If it was the SFRM, it's on site. Maybe there's a record of the fireproofing contractor. Maybe the fireproofing contractor sprayed their name on something or put a sticker of some kind on the wall next to a beam that identified their company so that they could get a phone call. First thing is to identify what the material is that's been used. Is it IFRM, SFRM, gypsum board assemblies, endothermic wraps that have been used? And then once you identify the material type, hopefully we can identify the manufacturer of that material. How do you identify the material? Plans and specifications, if they're available. Listings, if they're left in the building someplace. And if not, start taking pictures. Thank goodness for cellular phones, mobile phones. We can email a picture, text it to somebody almost immediately. Crazy thing is, many of the manufacturers and contractors and others in the industry, when looking at a picture, can probably say with some degree of certainty whose material was used in that particular application. A little bit harder with the intumescent fire resistant materials because it's not as obvious to know which type of material was used. And then date of the installation. At one point, there were a manufacturer that had a large percentage of market share of the gypsum-based SFRM materials. Another manufacturer was heavy into the mineral wool-based SFRM. Color can tell us which type that is, and it can narrow down what the manufacturer name was. Once it's narrowed down, the manufacturer can either visit the site and identify, yep, that's our material or not, or the manufacturer can take some of the material back to their laboratory and let their chemists determine the chemical footprint of that material to figure out exactly whose material it is. Forensic analysis can be done through chemistry. The manufacturers have the records of what the chemical makeup of those products were, and they can back into what it is. It might take some time to get that done. It might require an independent laboratory to get that done in conjunction with the manufacturer. It might cost money to get that done too, because we're not saying that kind of analysis, that depth of analysis was free. You might be thinking to yourself, geez, this is only fireproofing. It's only a little bit that was knocked out. What are we worried about? What we're worried about is continuity of fire resistance. Having the individual encasement continuous on that structural element is what the building code is asked for. If there's issues with the fireproofing, and it's proven that the non-consistent patches were a contributor to it, it could be a big problem. IFRM is the same process, basically. A little bit different, though, because the IFRM is difficult to tell whose is whose. Top coats can hide the color. There's a lot to worry about in that one. However, it can be scraped off. Chemical analysis can be done of IFRM as well. Photos can be sent to the manufacturers. The manufacturers can come out and visit And again, if there's listings somewhere on the project site, the listing number will determine or back us into what manufacturer's product was used, so that we can use that for the repairs of fire resistance rated assemblies. Is there a miracle product? Nope, not necessarily. The listings is what needs to be there. The individual encasement needs to be there as well. And it seems to assume a continuous material in the for patching based on the commentary on the International Building Code. You can spend some time looking at this. You know, I've taken an excerpt around, out of that 704.3 commentary, where it says individual encasement, though not defined, is attained by using tested design assemblies that provide gypsum board applied directly to the member or to studs, mastic and intumescent coatings, and spray fire-resistant materials. So it really assumes one continuous material. Good question. The authority having jurisdiction is really who determines what materials are acceptable for that. But just know that the listings are with one continuous material. Consistency chemically, the manufacturer of the fireproofing products can tell you what is compatible and what's not compatible. So I'm right on the 2 o'clock Central Time. Just know that managing fire-resistive construction is important. It makes good fire and life safety sense. And without it, we have no idea what the protection is that's on buildings. So I promised a 1-hour program. I've given a 1-hour program. And a big thank you to you for being part of the webinar today. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in, and I'll do my best to capture your question and get an answer on it. Just know that the fire resistance in buildings is quite important. Without it, we don't have a protected building. Know that the listings from the UL directory, the FM approval guide, the Intertech directory are all how we figure out whether or not we've got a fire resistance rated design. The UL directory is where we'd find it. The assemblies have ratings. It'll have the materials that were used to provide those ratings based on the listed assembly. Let's see if we can get to a particular design and take us through it. So looking at this A702, it's going to show us some kind of a deck assembly, and then it's going to tell us what kind of materials could be used in this assembly. Knowing that it's the MK6, again, backing into this assembly, we've got a great idea as to what was used in that particular application. Next question, what kind of a testing laboratory can perform identification testing? Great question. There are construction material laboratories that do chemical analysis on various materials worldwide. I don't want to throw names out because it might say, you're mentioning one lab over another, but there are companies. I'm not doing this to plug them or anything, but I think West J.D. and Elsner, Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager. Think of any of those laboratories would have facilities to be able to have chemical chemists on staff to be able to figure out the footprint of that chemical footprint of that product. Those are the types of organizations you might want to look at. Great question. Really appreciate you asking it. Other questions? Other questions going once? Questions going twice? Feel free to ask questions if you have them. Happy to cover them. And questions going 3 times. If I don't see questions, that means that we covered the material, hopefully quite well for you. That's our goal every time we do one of these webinars, is to cover the material so that we educate the marketplace meaning the industry, the fireproofing industry. Because each of you who are fireproofing contractors, NFCA member manufacturers, distributors, reps, building official friends, architect, specifier, engineer friends, by attending these webinars, our charge to you is to take fire resistance as seriously as we do. You prove obviously that you do because you're on this call, but get vocal about it. Talk about it, that it needs maintenance just like sprinklers and alarm systems do to your clients if you're a specifier, architect, or engineer. Let them know they've got a risk, possible risk. They determine what their risk is, not us. But let them know what the International Fire Code says, what NFPA 1 says, what NFPA 101 says. Let them know that continuous fire resistance, whether it's the structural assembly or the compartmentation, has got to be maintained. And that if fire spread takes place or collapse of building, that the lawyers are going to be looking everywhere, and the building owner manager wants to make sure that they're protected, and most importantly, that they do what is the right thing. Most building owners and managers, all the ones I've met, they all want to do the right thing, and make sure, obviously, to minimize expense while they're doing it. But they all have the best of intentions. They're not intentionally forgetting the fire resistance. Just not something that's been done in our culture of buildings for the life cycle of the building. Another question came in while I was talking. I actually do have a question on dissimilar materials. You mentioned that a column could have SFRM on 3 sides, but not gypsum on the 4th side. Have those guidelines since changed? They have not. The International Building Code had code proposals in 2 different cycles. I sat on the Fire Safety Committee both of those cycles. Those proposals were voted down, and the continuous encasement, continuous fire resistance, was the reason statement given in those particular applications. It was in the FS series, Fire Safety series of code proposals, and it was like number 1, 2, 3, or 4 in FS 1, 2, 3, or 4 for the 2015 International Building Code and 2018 International Building Code development process. You can go to CDP Access, ICC's CDP Access, to find those code proposals if you want. You can see the results for yourself. Great question. Thank you for asking it. Next question, what do we recommend for patching if the SFRM can't be identified by the owner and doesn't want to pay for laboratory testing? I love that question. You know, in every industry, the word that's used is technical infeasibility for not being able to get something done, because sometimes building officials say nothing's impossible, it just costs money, as does other organizations. So let's say, for instance, it's technically infeasible to identify what material it is. The Life Safety Digest that I mentioned in earlier in the presentation has an article on patching fireproofing. And what the manufacturers of fireproofing recommend is first to patch with the exact same material that was used. In the case that it cannot be identified, it has to be patched with the same type of material. So let's say it's an intumescent fire-resistant material, and it's epoxy-based. Then that same material has to be patched with an epoxy-based intumescent. Whether it exists in the world or not, I don't know. If it's an intumescent latex material, it has to be patched with an intumescent latex material if the brand and manufacturer are not known. If it's a mineral wool SFRM, it has to be patched with mineral wool SFRM. Same thing with gypsum-based SFRMs. So it really goes back to the type of fireproofing if it cannot be determined which manufacturer's material was used. But they're very clear, each of the manufacturers, and these are the people that make the materials, they invent them, they know the chemical footprint because they invented them, they fire tested them. Some of them have their own laboratories and stand next to the fire test, obviously in a safe position, to know where the exact end failure point of those materials are. They're the ones that are saying, hey, if you're going to patch this stuff, you got to do it a certain way. If they recommend a certain way using the same material, That's what you should stick with. They're the ones that know the chemistry, not somebody else. Great question. Thank you so much. Okay, so taking a pause to see if there's any more questions while we're at it. I'll plug the NFCA's Fire Resistance in Buildings seminar in Los Angeles, October 3rd, 2019. It's going to be a great program. We've got some awesome speakers covering lots of different items. Rich Walke is flying in from UL to talk about fire resistance. This might be one of the last presentations you see him do as an employee of UL because he'll be retiring in the next few months, I think. So don't miss it. It's going to be great fun. So looking at the screen, I don't see any more questions coming in. Questions going once. Questions going twice. Questions going 3 times. Okay, so seeing no further questions, we'll wrap up this webinar. The National Fireproofing Contractors Association, NFCA, thanks you for being part of the webinar. We appreciate the relationship that we have with the members, as well as our friends in the industry that are on the webinar today. Thank you for taking your time to be on it. We really appreciate you spending some time on something that we feel is very important, and that's fire resistance in buildings. Have yourself a great month, and until the next webinar, signing off from Chicago, Bill McHugh, Executive Director of the National Fireproofing Contractors Association. Thanks, everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.